Well, welcome to episode 430 of 10-Minute Record Reviews, and this is the 12th in my series of label guides, and this time I'm going to focus on one of the biggest and oldest names in jazz, Columbia. I should say parenthetically that I know I've been away for some time, and I apologize. It's largely been because of the scale of this project. Columbia Records is a huge label. In fact, the size of this project is such that I've divided this guide into two videos, one that takes us from the beginning to about the end of the 1960s, and then a second which deals with the remainder of the Columbia story, but also deals with things like logos, labels, and catalog numbers. Columbia's place in jazz history is, I would say, paradoxical. On the one hand, Columbia was responsible for some of the most admired, the most collected, and the most influential records in jazz history. Miles Davis's Kind of Blue, Dave Brubeck's Time Out, Herbie Hancock's Headhunters, and so on. But on the other hand, Columbia's jazz catalog also includes industrial amounts of dated, banal, overly commercial, tedious schlock, now found in volume at the Salvation Army in Valley Village next to all the Nana Mouskouri records. And this dichotomy, a few great records and a whole bunch of crap, basically stems from the difference between Columbia on the one hand and some of the better known independent jazz labels like Blue Note, Prestige, and Riverside. As I say, those other labels were independents. Columbia, from 1938 on anyway, was part of a massive company, the Columbia Broadcasting System, or CBS. And CBS had its own priorities. It was a public company, it was listed on the New York Stock Exchange, and it was answerable to shareholders. By contrast, the independent labels were owned and operated typically by jazz fans and operated on the economic margins. And that meant that Columbia focused on high-volume, mass-market appeal. It meant that Columbia shied away from musical experiments and what it felt was radical politics. But it also meant that Columbia had huge resources, which occasionally allowed Columbia to make huge impacts on the world of music, both technologically and artistically. In particular, Columbia's research and development muscle changed the way we listen to music on vinyl. And to the few groundbreaking artists that Columbia considered to be marketable, huge resources were applied. They became not just bestsellers, but world historical musical figures. So in this video, I'll return time and again to this paradox at the heart of Columbia, the tussle between the corporate conservatism that kept Columbia rooted in safe choices and the extraordinary moments in which Columbia created landmarks of jazz history. In this video, I'm going to focus on 5 things. It'll come as no surprise that the first of those is to focus on the history. I'm going to summarize the history of the label. I'm going to focus in particular on the kinds of music being released and on the quality of that music. And I want to note right away that while Columbia's history obviously goes back into the 19th century, this channel's focus has always been on long-playing records. So my attention is focused on the years between 1948 and 1990, in which the LP is the dominant form in which Columbia is releasing music. Secondly, I'm going to focus on the people. Along the way, I'm going to add detail about the various personalities that were key at different points in Columbia's development. I'm going to talk about artists, but also I'm going to talk about people on the A&R side, where some of the key artistic choices were made. Third, I'm going to focus on some of Columbia's sub-imprints, not just Columbia obviously as the main label, but also some of its most significant subsidiaries, OK Records, Epic Records, and Harmony Records. Fourth, I'm going to talk about what I might term as record lore, the change in logos over time, the change in labels over time, and the meaning of specific series of catalog numbers. And finally, I'll wrap up, as always, by adding some tips for new collectors of jazz on Columbia. Before I get going, I want to acknowledge some intellectual debts. The first of those is to the great people, Mike Callahan and others, at Both Sides Now publications. They have compiled so many amazing discographies, and on top of that, there are also graphics that come along with that, and narratives explaining the development of particular labels, invaluable. Secondly, as always, I'm grateful for the label lore compiled by the London Jazz Collector. And third, I'm also grateful for the discographic information compiled by Tom Lord, and also by the studious nerds at the Jazz Discography Project. Of course, needless to say, while I've had at my disposal all of that great information, I'm sure I've made some errors, and those, of course, are my responsibility. In talking about Columbia, I'm going to refer to 3 general eras, defined in part by the technology in use, but also by some important watersheds in music and in the industry. The first is what I'm going to call the pre-78 or the pre-LP era. Now, I know I said that my focus here is on LPs, but I don't think you can tell the story of Columbia after World War II unless you have some kind of understanding of what happened in the key early years of jazz, of recorded jazz anyway, in the 1920s and the 1930s. And so my starting point is from the adoption of the 78 RPM record as the industry standard in 1925, and from there until 1948, jazz on Columbia is released on 10-inch, 78 RPM singles, one song per side. And in fact, jazz on 78s on Columbia is produced well after 1948, but for the purposes of our analysis, I'm going to call the pre-LP 78 RPM era the period from 1925 to 1947. The second era I'm going to talk about is what I'm going to call the modern jazz era, which is ushered in by Columbia's own technology, which creates both the 10-inch and the 12-inch long playing record, which rotated at 33 1/3 RPM. The introduction of this technology also coincides with the emergence of what we might call modern jazz, and I'm going to date this period, the classic period of modern jazz, from 1948 to 1970. Now, for a lot of labels, I tend to stop around 1970 because there were a lot of buyouts and collapses that happened around then, particularly amongst the independents, but not so Columbia. In fact, Columbia has a second wind, a second heyday, which begins about 1970. And so the third era I'm going to talk about, what I refer to as the later vinyl era, runs from 1971 to 1990, when the CD has become dominant. Vinyl is no longer the principal means of recorded music being sold, and in any event, Columbia has been bought out by Sony. Now, if I say I'm stopping the story at 1990, of course, the history of jazz in Columbia doesn't stop at that particular point, but I would say it's fair to say it's a shadow of what it once was. And as this channel is fundamentally focused on listening to vinyl records, and 1990 is basically the end of vinyl's dominance, that's where I'm going to end. So here's a little graphic to show you these three eras. The pre-LP 78 era, which runs from 1925 to 1947, the modern jazz era, which runs from 1948 to 1970, and the later vinyl era, which runs from 1971 to 1990. And these three periods have distinct characteristics. The 78 era sees early success and then Depression era struggles for Columbia, but then a revival after CBS buys out the label and John Hammond arrives as a major force and a major artistic force in A&R. In the modern jazz era, Mitch Miller, a hugely conservative force in A&R at Columbia, ensures that jazz as high art comes in a distant second to the pursuit of profit. And the later vinyl era from 1971 to 1990, coming after the near death of jazz on the label, sees Columbia arguably for the first time since the 1920s being right at the cutting edge of jazz, at least for a while. I won't spend too much time on the early history of recorded music, but we should recognize that Columbia was founded in 1889 by Edward Easton as the Columbia Phonograph Company. The company soon diversified into recorded music and ways to play that music. And in 1912, the company was split. Columbia Phonograph went off to focus on making the Graphonola record player, and it eventually becomes, of all things, the Dictaphone Company, if you remember dictaphones. Meanwhile, Columbia Records, the record label, stayed with recording music and making records, although the two companies retained for a while some degree of connection. However, times after World War I were tough, and in the early 1920s, Columbia Records went into receivership. And in 1925, they were bought by their own British subsidiary, the Columbia Graphophone Company. There are several reasons why 1925 is significant. First of all, as I mentioned, that is the year of the British buyout, which brings more resources to bear for Columbia for the first time in several years. Secondly, it was in 1925 that Columbia finally abandoned acoustic recording. That was where the musicians all had to arrange themselves around a giant intake horn spaced out variously within the studio to be able to get some kind of balance, in favor of electric recording, which greatly increased the quality of recorded music. Finally, it's also in 1925 that 78 RPM becomes the industry standard for 10-inch shellac records. Prior to that point, Columbia had of course released 78s, but other speeds like 60 RPM and 120 RPM were not uncommon. So beginning in 1925, the 5-year period from there until 1930 was a period of great success for Columbia and of real significance from a jazz point of view. One of the reasons for that was the acquisition of OK Records, a company largely geared towards black listeners and which had a great number of jazz and blues artists already signed up, including arguably the greatest of them all, Louis Armstrong. And with respect to OK Records, this being America in the 1920s, the age of the Klan, there was, of course, a racial or racist component to this. OK signed many of the black artists that Columbia didn't necessarily want to market directly. We also begin to see in this period the same dichotomy which is typical of Columbia for many decades, where a number of performers of real artistic merit are joined on the label by a high volume of commercial music which blurred the lines between jazz and pop. So you see popular dance band leaders, people like Ted Lewis, Ben Selvin, Guy Lombardo, and Paul Whiteman, whose music was jazz, loosely defined, but not particularly innovative. It became known as sweet jazz, and they packed the dance halls with it, but you also had on Columbia and on OK Records some brilliant early jazz music, including Armstrong's Hot Fives and Hot Sevens recordings, amongst the most famous jazz recordings of all time. You also had Clarence Williams, Ethel Waters, and then in the 1930s, the great, somewhat unsung band leader, Fletcher Henderson. All this music was, of course, released as 78 RPM singles on 10-inch shellac discs, which was the unchallenged format of recorded music being released in America in the quarter century from the mid-1920s until the late 1940s. And I have a number of charts here to give you a sense of the Columbia setup and the various waves of activity. So here's the first one. Now, in addition to OK Records, which tended to have more black artists and focused more on a black audience, Columbia also had a label called Harmony Records, which was basically a budget label. There was original music on Harmony, but also there were a lot of reissues. What I'm showing you here is a sum total of unique jazz 78s released by Columbia and its two main sub-labels in this era, OK and Harmony. That amounts to nearly 4,500 unique releases on 78. I'm showing you the entirety of the 78 era from the standardization of the format in 1925, which is at the left-hand side of the graph, until the very last Columbia Jazz 78 was released, all the way into 1958 at the far right, a decade after the introduction of the long-playing record. And what you can see here is that the production of 78s by Columbia was anything but a straight line from the 1920s to the 1950s. First of all, the 1920s was a period of great success for Columbia, and this was the period, the 1920s, in which Louis Armstrong was releasing his tremendous Hot Fives and Hot Sevens sessions. Now here's a chart of the bigger names in jazz on Columbia and on OK in this period. I've reproduced pictures of some of the more noteworthy artists on here. Louis Armstrong, of course, at the left, but also the band leaders Clarence Williams and Fletcher Henderson, and the singers Lee Morse and Ethel Waters. And these are just the most prolific jazz artists. There were smaller numbers of recordings in Columbia by the great blues singer Bessie Smith and a handful by Duke Ellington. Incidentally, looking at the fellow just to the right of Louis Armstrong, if you remember the character from the Mod Squad, played by Clarence Williams III, well, that's his grandfather in this picture. Now, the Depression absolutely crushes Columbia, although it survived longer than some, and in fact, by the early 1930s, it was the oldest surviving record label in the world. But then reality took over, as it did for the whole industry. Records were a luxury and people were poor. There's a complicated story about Columbia's corporate history in the 1930s. It's very interesting, but it's also kind of complex, and so I've left it on the cutting room floor. Here's the short version. In the 1920s, Columbia Records had co-founded the Columbia Broadcasting System as a radio venture, but they had soon sold their stake. And so CBS, having been sold off, goes off and actually becomes a giant broadcasting concern. Meanwhile, for Columbia Records, tough times in the Depression lead to buyouts, forced sales, a parent company called ARC, receivership, and bankruptcies between 1931 and 1938. By the time you get to about 1933 or 1934, there wasn't much happening jazz-wise on Columbia at all, and in fact, the whole thing was barely kept afloat by the sales of country gospel records made by an outfit called the Chuckwagon Gang. So if that was where things had finished, there wouldn't be much more to tell, and I certainly wouldn't be doing this jazz record label guide for Columbia. However, in a strange twist, in 1938, Columbia ends up getting bought out by its former subsidiary, CBS. CBS's chief executive, its main man, a guy called William S. Paley, was a major mover and shaker in the media world by this time. And having bought Columbia Records, he then brings in a guy called Edward Wallerstein. He poached him from RCA to run the label. Columbia is reincorporated and it's up and running by 1939. And one of the very first things that Wallerstein does with the company reconstituted is to bring in a musical genius to run the artistic side, John Hammond. Hammond is probably the most famous name in musical talent spotting in 20th century American history. And his know-how, his artistic focus, combined with the deep pockets of CBS, fundamentally transformed Columbia Records into a jazz powerhouse. Or should I say, a powerhouse which included jazz. Because Columbia was, first and foremost, and would remain, a mass-market popular label. And that allowed them to do great things, but it also kept them tethered to the musical mainstream. So if we look again at that chart, which shows the production of 78 records by Columbia and its subsidiaries, and here I'll show you a different version, one which separates out the Columbia and OK and Harmony Records releases. If we look at this chart, looking at those totals, you'll see the effect of the buyout and of Hammond's arrival. Columbia and its subsidiaries had basically given up the ghost by the late 1930s until the buyout, until Hammond's arrival, and then there's a boom which exceeds all previous levels of production. And you can see it's the same general boom and bust pattern for Columbia, the parent label, and for its subsidiaries. I draw your attention here to the orange part of that graph, which is OK Records. OK, of course, is a storied name in jazz history, and it really just has the two periods of great activity, up to about 1931, and again for a few years either side of 1940. But the big story really is the impact of Hammond. He was serious about jazz, and he got Columbia serious about jazz. Here are the most prolific recording artists in jazz for Columbia between the CBS buyout in 1938 and the dawn of the LP era at the end of the 1940s, about a decade. And there are some pretty big names on here. It's kind of a crowded chart, so I've left off the band leaders who were of the least challenging, most commercial, sweet jazz persuasion. The big star of the era in terms of sales was Benny Goodman, but there are a lot of other major band leaders on here as well. They include Harry James, Gene Krupa, Count Basie, Claude Thornhill, very influential to Miles Davis, Woody Herman, and Duke Ellington. And at the right-hand end, you can also see Billie Holiday, signed by Hammond, and she became a big star on his watch. By the dawn of the 1940s, Columbia was now a major player. Not necessarily the market leader, that was likely an honor which still went to RCA Victor at that point. But then came the war, which was fairly challenging for record companies to navigate. And that was for several reasons. Wartime austerity, the shortage of shellac, which was used for armaments as well as for making records, and then the recording ban, which occurs in the United States from 1942 to 1944. The ban, of course, came about because the main musicians union in the United States was concerned that recorded music was putting musical performers out of work. And with respect to the ban, I'm going to show you that chart again, and you can see the impact that the ban had. There it is, that steep decline after 1942-43. You can see the impact that it had on Columbia's record production, from an all-time high to next to nothing in the space of a year. However, the recording ban and the shellac shortage, both these factors influence record companies to focus on research and development to kind of bootstrap themselves out of their current situation. Columbia, of course, too, had been working not only on vinyl records, but on other kinds of technology to extend playing time. And by the end of 1947, Columbia had perfected a new medium for recorded music, the long-playing record, or LP. And the LP would fundamentally change the way that jazz was both played and recorded. In early 1948, Columbia Records unveiled something that would forever change the way that music was heard, the long-playing record, or the LP. The first version was a 10-inch diameter record, and in the 1950s, the 12-inch diameter record appears. This was a massive change, and it took the musical world some time to catch up with its implications. A 78 RPM record limited you to 3.5 to 4 minutes per side, so not only were you limited to 2 songs, it had to be 2 songs of a certain length. And even to this day, the 3.5-minute pop song, a form with which we're all familiar, is basically inherited from the limitations of the 78 RPM record. Liberation from this format would eventually be quite liberating for jazz, but Columbia wasn't really thinking about jazz when it developed the LP. Everyone was dealing with inherited expectations, and as far as anyone knew, musicians and record executives, a jazz track was 3.5 minutes long. You didn't need to change that. The major problem had been classical music, which of course ran a lot longer than that. So, after wowing the musical press with its introduction of the LP, Columbia proceeds to move its classical productions onto that format, but jazz remains, for the most part, stuck on 78. And in fact, it's not until the 12-inch record replaces the 10-inch record as the industry standard in the mid-1950s that jazz on Columbia moves wholesale onto the LP. If we have another look at that chart, you can see that Columbia keeps on putting out jazz 78s until 1958. By contrast, their independent competitors like Blue Note or Prestige had abandoned 78s around 1950 or 51 and had been putting out jazz on LPs all the way through the decade. Columbia, of course, was not really concerned about the independent record labels. They were concerned about their big competitors, the big boys, and that, of course, included their main competitors, RCA Victor. When they introduced the LP, Columbia was still smaller than RCA. And RCA, despite having the technology for LPs made available to them by Columbia, bet on their own alternative, which was the 45. The so-called speed wars ensued, and the 45 does end up becoming the home for rock singles and R&B singles. But classical and jazz found a more natural home on the LP. And by the time RCA concedes defeat in the speed wars and begins putting out its own LPs in the mid-1950s, Columbia had established an unassailable lead in the marketplace and was now the biggest record label in the world. Columbia had held jazz back from its new format for a number of years, but by 1955, the LP had become Columbia's default jazz format. Despite healthy sales, however, when it came to artistic quality, Columbia was lagging far behind a lot of its other competitors. There are a variety of reasons for this, but most of them come back to one problem. The goateed supremo of all things A&R at Columbia in the 1950s and 1960s, the Satan of sing-along, Mitch Miller. Now, Mitch Miller might have had the facial hair of a beatnik, but he was anything but. He hated rock and roll, which of course was the big thing in the mid-1950s, and when it came to jazz, he took a pretty dim view of anything that was not safe and polite. He'd come from Mercury Records in 1950, and although he wasn't directly in charge of jazz A&R, that fell to two very influential people, John Hammond and George Avakian, he was their boss. And those two had to work hard to persuade him to take any risks at all. And this is where Columbia as a company with shareholders differed from little labels like Blue Note, run by dedicated jazz fans who marketed cutting-edge jazz to make a buck. Columbia had no need to be the cutting edge, thanks to a massive distribution network into pretty much every department store in America. They set tastes rather than responding to them. Here's a breakdown by musical style of the LPs that Columbia puts out between 1948 and 1970. And my apologies to those viewers who are still watching on black and white TVs. So again, this is the modern jazz era from 1948 to 1970. The different colors in this chart are different styles of jazz. You can see in the early part of the graph on the left-hand side, Columbia has not fully embraced the LP for jazz. It's still putting out a lot of jazz on 78s. That changes around 1955, where 12-inch LPs become the mainstream for jazz. The dark blue category at the bottom is big band music. The green, just on top of that, is jazz vocals. And between 1948 and the mid-1960s, those two genres, big band music and jazz vocals, dominate Columbia's output. And it's interesting to contrast this with Blue Note records. So on this chart, the two lighter blue categories just above that, representing bebop, hard bop, and cool jazz and post bop, those categories represented almost the entirety of Blue Note's catalog in this period. But at Columbia, as you can see, that music, the music that would have been on Blue Note or Prestige, that music was a small minority. But, there's a caveat to all this. And as I mentioned, in the 1950s, there were two visionary characters involved in A&R in jazz at Columbia who were quite influential. And those were John Hammond and George Avakian. And every now and then, they won an argument with Mitch Miller. And the result is that amid a sea of easy listening schlock, Columbia, with its deep pockets, occasionally signed a great jazz artist. In particular, in the middle of the decade, Columbia landed two big names, Dave Brubeck and Miles Davis. And whether it was just serendipity or if it was part of a general invigoration of the modern jazz ethos at Columbia, this also coincides with a major change to the look and feel of Columbia Records, and in particular, the adoption of the famous 6i label. So I'm going to show you a few examples of the Columbia labels before the 6i and then subsequently. So this is a record which came out, I think, 54 or 55, thereabouts. It is a record of Benny Goodman's music, but it's a compilation focusing on the contribution of the great guitarist Charlie Christian. And so here is what Columbia Records looked like prior to this. I think it's an American. It's a Canadian one. So it's going to look a little bit darker. The American ones would have been a brighter red. So here is a classic Columbia Records 12-inch release from 1955, I think. You can see it's got deep groove. It's got the wordmark Columbia above, and it has the LP logo below center. And now here is a J.J. Johnson and Kai Winding record, or Kai Winding record, and this is, I think, one of the first 6i's I have, and you'll see what a radical redesign this is. There we go. The 6i design. So you can see that Columbia Records, the wordmark is now a serif wordmark arced over the top. You have the 6 walking eyes, which is in theory actually a stylus on a record. You have to kind of work to be able to see that. But that is the basic redesign, the famous Columbia 6i design, which is fairly coterminous with the greatest era of jazz in the label's history. Here's a J.J. Johnson from the same era, and a Jerry Mulligan, and here's a Brubeck 6i from that period, and so on. Here's a Miles, it's a reissue from many years later, but Columbia has, for our benefit, replicated kind of latter-day version of the 6i label. There's no deep groove, of course, because this is a very recent record, but again, it's an iconic label. And just for the sake of interest, Joe Wilder, and this is a 6i, but it is a promo, and so you can see, like all promos, or most promos, it's white, but again, the 6i design is still there. I have a couple of examples of the Canadian 6i as well, which was a bit different. Again, it was kind of the maroon thing. So here's an Ellington Indigos copy from the era, and here is the 6i mono, again, maroon and silver as opposed to red and black. So in terms of graphic design, but more importantly in terms of musical content, you can really say that the mid-1950s was the true birth of modern jazz on Columbia. And here's a graphic showing the most prolific artists on Columbia in the modern jazz period between 1948 and 1970. And I would just say parenthetically that this also includes releases on Columbia's smaller sub-imprints, Harmony Records and Epic Records in this time. And there are three things that occur to me when I look at this chart. So first of all, when I'm looking at the people on here and I compare this lineup to the artists that were on Blue Note or on Prestige, candidly, it's notable how many more black artists were on those labels than on Columbia. Out of the 10 biggest jazz sellers at Columbia in the 1950s and 1960s, I'm showing you here, there are just 3 black artists. And I don't say that just deliberately, perversely to focus on race. It's just more that the cutting edge of jazz, the most exciting experimentation was with a small number of exceptions in the 1950s, the preserve of black artists. And that mention of experimentation takes me to the second thing that occurs when I look at this chart. So during the peak period of modern jazz, with its small groups and the exciting developments that were happening like bebop and hard bop, Columbia's big sellers, strangely, were very often throwbacks. They weren't cutting edge at all. Duke Ellington, Benny Goodman, Les Elgart, Errol Garner, Les Brown, all of these musicians either had their best days behind them or were recycling stale musical styles, or both. And yes, I know that Duke, and even Benny Goodman for that matter, had their moments after World War II, but my take, maybe controversial, is that after World War II, or certainly after 1950, Duke was basically in the business of showing that he still had it. The days of knocking the world on its ear by giving them something really radically new and exciting were gone. And as for the other people in this chart, well, Andre Previn was capable of good music, but he rarely challenged listeners particularly. Frank Sinatra rode the line between jazz and pop, as did Tony Bennett. The third thing, which I guess is a corollary of the previous point, is that when I look at this chart, there are very few envelope pushers here. Arguably, only two of the artists on here, Miles Davis and Dave Brubeck, resemble what one might call the cutting edge of jazz in this period, Davis certainly being the greater innovator of the two. And Brubeck's innovations, which to be clear I don't want to put down, were still of the more cerebral or music nerd variety than they were tending to startle or provoke. His records reliably sold in large quantities, and in fact, if your music was edgy or pushing boundaries, there was precious little room for you at Columbia. There's no Coltrane in this period, no Ornette Coleman, no Andrew Hill, no Eric Dolphy. Now, having made all these great generalizations, there are of course some exceptions. Although his number of releases didn't make the chart, there was room on Columbia for Charles Mingus for a couple of records. There is a Jazz Messengers LP, quite good one actually, including Hank Mobley and Donald Byrd and Horace Silver, really from the great era of the Messengers. Is one Jazz Messengers record from that time. Later on in the 1960s, there was room for Thelonious Monk, from whom Columbia probably got his last great years. There was room for Charles Lloyd, and there was also room in Columbia's great subsidiary label, Epic Records, for jazz music which might have challenged Mitch Miller's sensibilities and wasn't going to make the big label. Epic was founded in 1953 as Columbia's overflow label, basically to avoid diluting Columbia's conservative brand. Later on, Epic shifted more towards pop and rock, but in the 1950s, Epic was a significant producer of very good, fairly challenging jazz that you weren't necessarily going to find on Columbia. For instance, music by Horace Silver, who put out this record, Silver's Blue, an excellent record, and also a record by Ahmad Jamal. Not big long runs of records on Epic for these artists, but nevertheless, they were signed and they did produce some music which we can be all thankful is part of the canon. In addition to those records, Epic put out records by Herbie Mann, by Kenny Clarke, by Phil Woods, Art Blakey. All those artists made records for Epic in this period. Nevertheless, as I say, those were the exceptions. Here's another graphic which I put together to show you how marginal the very best modern jazz was on Columbia in these years. So if you think about genres like, or subgenres I guess, like bebop, hard bop, modal jazz, and soul jazz, these were all very small slivers of Columbia's output in those years. So looking at this graphic, you can see that on the right-hand side, swing and big band is nearly 40% of everything that Columbia put out between 1948 and 1970. Jazz vocal is almost another quarter. Columbia's output was dominated by dated musical styles and dated musical artists. There were just a handful of musicians, people like Miles Davis, Thelonious Monk, Charles Mingus, Charles Lloyd, arguably Dave Brubeck, who were offering something a bit more challenging, and Columbia's strategy was to support a few of those top-selling artists for decades, whether they were challenging artists like Davis or more comforting artists like Errol Garner, and let the rest sink or swim. And many other artists came and made one or two LPs and left. So as I say, for a handful of big stars, Columbia offered significant backing. Every time Dave Brubeck sneezed, Columbia put out a record of his. Miles Davis, probably over time the most artistically challenging artist that Columbia had on its roster, was at the same time guaranteed box office because of his extensive history and name recognition. Mitch Miller might not have liked his stuff, but he couldn't argue with his record sales, which were the bottom line. And this is the era which produces the most paradoxical outcomes. Columbia, who had released some of the most syrupy, most orchestral, most commercial jazz records in the 1950s by the boatload, also produced several records in this period which would make anybody's list of the top 10 jazz records of all time, and perhaps not coincidentally, the best-selling jazz records of all time. And these, of course, include a magnificent trio of records from 1959. Miles Davis's Kind of Blue, there it is, Dave Brubeck's Time Out, and Charles Mingus's Mingus I have a very undistinguished copy of the latter. Three magnificent records which you will find on most people's top 10 lists. But it wasn't just those records. There were other masterpieces around the same time as well. Miles Davis's Milestones, Someday My Prince Will Come, and of course, Sketches of Spain. Then we have Johnny Cole's The Warm Sound, J.J. Johnson's Blue Trombone, and other records like Billie Holiday's Lady in Satin. I mention here for another record which makes a lot of people's top 10 lists, which Columbia puts out, in the mid to late 1950s. This one, Duke Ellington's Return to Newport in 1956. As I say, this record makes a lot of people's lists. For me, I have to say, I feel this is a bit of a critic's darling. It was highly praised by a lot of jazz critics who happened to be at the festival. And I think it's a classic case, having listened to it a few times, of you had to be there. But that's the beauty of opinions. Everybody's got one. Those records I've just shown you really were, well, at least arguably, the apex of jazz on Columbia. And as the 1960s wore on, the lane for what you might call serious jazz on Columbia began to narrow. They still had some pretty solid acts like Charles Lloyd, but really only Miles and arguably Thelonious Monk had the room and the backing to push any boundaries at all. The famous producer Teo Macero, who arrived in the late 1950s, developed a partnership with Miles Davis, which took Miles's music to ever more challenging places, despite the fact that Miles had originally been very suspicious of the first wave of the avant-garde. This would seem to have set up a collision with Mitch Miller, but Mitch Miller leaves Columbia in 1965, and that would seem perhaps to open the door to more experimentation and more artistry in jazz. For 15 years, Mitch Miller had ruled A&R at Columbia with an iron fist, putting out endless, mind-numbing sing-along records and insisting on sales over artistry and risk-taking. But with his departure, the arrival of another Davis, not Miles, but Clive, ends up almost putting jazz on life support. Clive Davis took over Columbia A&R in 1965, and then within a year or two, he'd become the label president. And his plan, and he made no bones about it, was to make Columbia a major player in rock and roll, and they had to play catch-up to do that. In 1965, they basically had Bob Dylan and nobody else, but by 1970, Columbia was a major force in rock music. And as Clive Davis completed the job of turning Columbia into this rock and roll powerhouse, the money rolled in, dwarfing the income that had come from jazz. And this put jazz at Columbia under real threat. The artist roster shrank and the number of releases dwindled. Miles Davis, for his part, was indulged and tolerated and was allowed to treat the label basically like a bank in the later part of the 1960s, but otherwise jazz was allowed to shrivel. Public tastes were changing too, and it wasn't just because of rock. Soul music was threatening jazz as well. Columbia, of course, was an entity driven by shareholder interest, driven by the need to make a profit, and the number of jazz releases shrinks and shrinks and shrinks from nearly 70 in 1960 to just 9 in 1970. And that was the lowest amount of jazz which had been released on Columbia since the recording ban nearly 3 decades before. And so it looked very much by 1970 as though jazz was on its way out at Columbia. But one of those records released in 1970 was Bitches Brew. And that's a story I'll pick up in the next video.